Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Pierce, and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and your host for today's conversation. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. One of the joys of virtual events is collaborating with organizations we deeply admire all over the world, and we are grateful to be presenting today's conversation in partnership with our friends at the Center for the Art of Translation. The Center's publications, events, and educational programming enrich the library of vital literary works, nurture and promote the work of translators, build audiences for literature and translation, and honor the incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of our world. As we continue on to today's conversation, I just want to offer a quick Zoom webinar tutorial. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a few icons. One of those is a Q&A icon where you can enter in your question at any time during the conversation. Another button will get you to the chat window. That space is there for you all. Please feel free to chat during the event. My colleague Ashley will be in the chat as well, dropping in useful information, including links to books by our authors. We do make every effort to keep these events free to attend, in the hopes that you will purchase the featured books from us. So thank you in advance for taking a look and supporting independent bookstores. And finally, you can see us, but we can't see you, so relax and please enjoy today's conversation. Today, I have the great honor of introducing Margaret Jull Costa, Jenny McPhee, and Suzanne Jill Levine to discuss their translations of Maria Judite de Carvalho, Natalia Ginzburg, and Silvina Ocampo. Margaret Jull Costa has worked as a translator for over 30 years, translating the works of many Spanish and Portuguese writers, including Javier Marias, Jose Saramago, Fernando Pessoa, and Ana Luisa Amaral, among others. Her work has brought her many prizes, most recently the Premio Valle Inclán for On the Edge by Rafael Chirpes. In 2014, she was awarded an OBE for services to literature, as well as an Order of Service by the Portuguese government in 2018. And a Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Translation by the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute in New York. Jenny McPhee is the author of the novels The Center of Things, No Ordinary Matter, and A Man of No Moon, and co-authored Girls, Ordinary Girls and Their Extraordinary Pursuits. Her translations include works by Natalia Ginzburg, Primo Levi, and Elsa Morante, among others. She teaches literary translation and contemporary global literature at NYU's School of Professional Studies, where she is the academic director of continuing education at the Center for Applied Liberal Arts. She was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2020. Scholar, writer, and translator Suzanne Jill Levine has translated in her long career over 40 volumes of the most important 20th century Latin American writers, including Borges, Cortázar, and Manuel Puig. A Guggenheim Fellow, her many honors include PEN Prizes, National Endowments for the Arts and National Endowments for the Humanities grants, and a Rockefeller Fellowship. She founded and directed the Literary Translation Studies program at UC Santa Barbara, and her books include The Subversive Scribe, Translating Latin American Fiction, and Manuel Puig and the Spider Woman, His Life and Fictions. And today's moderator, Kate Zambreno, is the author of several works, most recently To Write as If Already Dead, a study of Hervé Guibert, and the novel Drifts. She is currently at work on The Light Room, a meditation on art and care amidst crisis, a collection of fiction, The Missing Person, and a novel, Foam. A 2021 Guggenheim Fellow in Nonfiction, she teaches at Columbia University and at Sarah Lawrence College. I'm so thrilled to have them here together in conversation. And now Margaret, Jenny, Jill, and Kate.
Hello.
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 It's so nice to be in conversation with you. So what space are you speaking from right now? Since this is an event that deals with space, I would love to hear what space you're in now.
I've just about had breakfast here, so I'm in my breakfast nook.
Jenny?
So I am virtually in Torino because of Natalia Ginzburg. I put up my virtual background, but I'm actually in Manhattan.
Yeah, and I'm in England in my office in Leicester.
Are you at the sites where you usually do your work, your translation work and your writing work?
Yeah.
Yes.
I actually translate wherever and whenever I can, so it's always sort of with me in any place I am.
I'm in Santa Barbara, which is far away from everything except for Harry and Megan, and 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 I often actually work a lot in a cafe here. I think I've produced. There's a certain cafe that where I often see other friends, and I think I've produced about 3 translations there in the last few years. So.
Well, this event is to celebrate the 3 of you, as well as specifically these 3 writers who you've translated, Silvina Ocampo, Natalia Ginzburg, and Maria Judite de Carvalho. Did I do that right, Margaret?
It was good. It was good.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. But one of the things we were speaking about before starting is that Maria Judite de Carvalho was a new writer for me. I never heard of her, and to read Margaret, your translation feels like such an incredible discovery. And I feel that as well, Jill, with Silvina Ocampo. So I would love to hear both of you speak about this discovery for you of these writers.
Well, Jill, do you want to go first?
You can go first, Margaret. Absolutely.
Okay. No, well, as I was saying, I hadn't read Maria Judite de Carvalho either until a friend who used to teach her at university said, you must read this book and you must translate this book. And so I actually read a novella by Maria Judite first, which is 2 lines also, no, they're going to publish, I think, So Many People, Mariana. And then I read Empty Wardrobes, Amários Vazios. And I was just, I'd never heard a voice like that in Portuguese. And I just found it so exhilarating to find this sharp, this acerbic wit, you know, in a female writer in Portugal. It's just not like anything else I'd ever read. So I was just thrilled. And
do you think that it was pretty striking at the time in which she was writing in Portugal? For the work is, I mean, the voice is so, there's such a rebelliousness, I think, to the voice. There's such a, I think with the acerbic wit, there it seems to be almost taking aim at something. Were you surprised to so was it the voice that originally drew you in?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't, as I say, it wasn't like any other writer I'd read in Portugal, certainly not a female writer. I mean, she's more, I've translated the 19th century novelist Essa de Queiroz, and it's more like that sharp wit, you know. And given, as I understand it, she was quite a shy woman, this is not a shy voice. You know, that's what really struck me, you know. It's just, and I was just choosing the reading that we're going to do. It was just so exciting. I just loved it again. You know, I translated it, but I thought it was very good, actually. I loved it, you know.
Well, I want to get to Jill and Jenny, but since you brought up that excerpt, maybe you could begin reading the voice so we could think about the voice a little bit.
Okay, yeah. It's just the opening couple of paragraphs, really. It's introducing the narrator is. It's a narrator who does later on become a character in the book, and she's talking about the main protagonist. She would say, or more likely think, because she was always a woman of few words, that it had been a spring day, which apparently at least began and ended like any other spring day. She never said more than was strictly necessary, the bare, indispensable minimum. Or else she would begin to say what was necessary, but quickly grow tired or stop midstream, as though she suddenly realized that it wasn't worth going on and was a waste of effort. She would sit quite still then, her face a blank, like someone poised on the edge of an ellipsis, or standing hesitantly at the sea's edge in winter, and at such moments all the light would go out of her eyes, as if absorbed by a piece of blotting paper. For all I know, she may still be like that, because I never saw her again. For a long time, I failed to understand that these lapses into unconsciousness, which is what they were, invariably led her back to the same place, or rather to the same person, to the same tarnished image of that person. Because, as I said, she was not a woman given to confessions. Words were of no use to her to explain her thoughts, to polish or disguise them, which is what most of us do. She only used them, and then only as a last resort, to say something urgent. And when she absolutely had to speak, she would fall silent immediately afterwards, or, as I say, stop halfway. And it wasn't only the light in her eyes that was switched off then, for her body too would droop slightly, as if someone had turned off its current, which, however low voltage, at least kept it active, as if her body had forgotten its original upright posture. When this happened, she wasn't really there, although no one knew where she was or who she was with. In fact, such a thought probably wouldn't occur to anyone because her face betrayed none of this, only her eyes and her hands. But who would notice her eyes, or indeed her hands, which lay half open on her lap, like shells washed up on the beach? Sometimes, when I was with her, I thought that perhaps what she needed was a good shake, or better still, an X-ray, so that we could see if she did actually have more inside her than just lungs and a digestive system.
It's
Really,
devastating.
it's really scorching, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's devastating on so many levels. I feel we're devastated for the main character, we're devastated for the narrator, and there is this burn it all aspect to the narrative voice. Do you have any memories of translating that passage?
I don't, honestly. I don't know about Jenny and Jill, but I don't remember when I've translated something. It just goes, it just disappears.
I know.
But
I always try to make notes to myself about little things that happened in the process of translation so that I'll remember, because it's just so interesting every time.
Yeah.
But then I forget, completely forget.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. True. Well, that's sort of why, and this is just what I did years ago. The reason why I really wrote this book about translation, it was based on notes that I would take because I thought that I was working with such incredible writers and in the beginning collaborating with them. And I said, my God, I have to somehow record this experience, record what's going on. And so, and that's what the subversive scribe really comes out of that, you know, trying to remember exactly what happened. But I think it's impossible because it's sort of like asking the centipede, you know, which foot goes first, you know. And
great image, Suzanne. That is exactly Jill. That's exactly.
I almost think the translator might remember more than the writer, right? That the translator is, in some ways, I'm thinking of Kate Briggs writing about like writing with. It's like a second translation as a second writing. There's a way that you are working over these sentences into your own sentences, and so there is maybe even more memory than the original writing of it.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I would say that it is there's an equivalence in how much attention we pay to each sentence.
Right.
I think we probably do pay more attention. I think we may perhaps pay more attention, but then once you've written it and once you've been through the translation so many times, it becomes your own, and then you forget it.
Right. I agree that with Jenny that it is like original writing in the sense that you're so much with it when you're with it, and then when it's done, it belongs to somebody else, really. Yeah.
It belongs to the reader. It takes up space within the reader then to be reading it themselves, writing it themselves. Jill, we were talking about how Silvina Ocampo is such a discovery for us, and I felt guilty realizing that I had not heard of her when I knew, of course, those in her circle, Cesares, her husband, and Borges. Can you talk a little bit about the discovery of Silvina Ocampo for you?
Yes, well, obviously I discovered Silvina many years ago when I was quite young. At the same time, I was discovering Borges and Bioy Casares, and the first translations I did of any of them was Bioy Casares, his very odd novellas. Plan for Escape was the first one, but then at the same time, I was so intrigued by Silvina that I translated a couple of her stories at that time. I would say that the reason why we took so long in the more global, I guess, space to get to know her, a lot of that has to do with the fact that she was a woman.
Mhm.
And that she was a woman, and obviously in this group of very, important male writers, particularly Borges. I mean, Borges it was really, although at the time when they were all together, they were all very marginal. We're talking about back in the 40s. They were considered very marginal, and Silvina's sister, Victoria Ocampo, had a very had a powerful, influence in the whole world of Argentine letters. And I would say that partly her older sister Victoria, is also responsible in some ways, because she was so critical of Silvina when she first started writing. Silvina is a very unusual writer, a real original. I mean, Italo Calvino, who speaks of her, and they were very close, says, "I don't know of another writer who better captures the magic inside everyday rituals, the forbidden or hidden face that our mirrors don't show us." And I don't think anybody could say that better. That is so true of her, the way she captures things that are everyday, and yet you see them in a way you've never saw it before. She did at first begin as a painter. And in the 1920s, she went to Europe and she studied with de Chirico. And of course, you naturally, like many of the Latin American writers of that time, very influenced by naturally surrealism. And I would say that, again, Julio Cortázar is another writer who you could see was actually influenced by Silvina. So what we did here with, thanks to City Lights, thanks to Programa Sur, and also thanks to my young collaborators, we actually did two books. One, which was the very first book she ever wrote, and which was seen for the first time. The title of it is Forbidden Journey, and Forbidden Journey refers to being born. The journey that you can't remember. And it's actually very funny the way this first sentence begins. I think it'll give you a clear idea of this.
Yep.
Of how
Please reach for us.
Okay, I will. She basically really captures the child's point of view. Okay, and I had this. Where did I had this somewhere? And now, of course, I've lost it, which is typical in me. I'm so organized, like Silvina. Let me see. Okay, I just want to read this one. The first sentence of the Forbidden Journey, which I can find it. But okay, let me see. Just give me 2 seconds here. Oh dear, where did it go? I think it's way in the back here. I got it somewhere. I'm looking in the wrong. Oh, that's what the problem is. Here it is. Forgotten Journey. I'm sorry. She was trying to remember the day she was born, and she frowned so much that every few minutes the grown-ups came over to make her smooth her brow, which is why she could never reach back to the memory of her birth. Just that sort of comment is so typical Silvina. But I would like to read for you, since the theme is the claiming of space, the most recent book of hers, which has not been translated at all. It's a book of miscellany, and in some ways reflects something she always wanted to do. She always wanted to write memoirs rather than her stories, but she ended up writing stories instead of her memoir. Although one could say the last book she wrote, The Promise, was a kind of a memoir. It's a novella. Yeah. It's very unusual. So this is called Army. This is just like a short epigrammatic piece. It's called Armies of the Night, which you could also call, I haven't decided if it's Armies of the Night or Sentinels of the Dark. One of them. Anyway, it begins thus, and it has a lot to do with your claiming space. At night, ships aren't the only ones that set sail. Houses do as well. The creaking wood announces good or bad weather, and if we don't fall asleep, we can get seasick. When trying to fall asleep in the total darkness of my room, ever since I was a child, I see an army in red and blue swiftly marching toward me till it fades, and then I find it once again in another dark corner where it marches toward me again. You might say that this could be a field of hyacinth flowers. After all, they are red and blue. It could also be a game board with colorful pieces, but I never thought it could be anything other than an army of little soldiers in red and blue uniforms who march in unison like a single soldier. To me, that army was always the army of the night. It is not only dark at night, this I know, but nevertheless, I saw it mostly at night, which to me is a place, the most important place in the world. At the moment the night army appears, I ponder, remember, inventing images and ideas that I don't recognize during the day. And this tiny idea of an army, this army of memories, of images in my mind, fights to survive and tries to kill me because its divisions can be meek like lambs or sweet like honey, but other times they hiss or yell or come wielding knives and poisons. They take cover in the infinite, unexplored labyrinth where I lose sight of them, only to find them again in the place where I'm always waiting for them in the dark. It's
Beautiful.
Lovely, yeah.
really, really beautiful. And yes, and there's so this is a little book again with aphorisms and short pieces like this one, short meditations. One that I think is very meaningful here is, I'm less afraid of dying than of living. The former happens only once, the latter, no one knows how many times. I mean, it's the way she looks at things that are amazing, but it's also, you know, with all her humor, there's a voice of despair. And I think the last book, The Promise, has very much that feeling, that this fear of, you know, ultimately not, of disappearing into oblivion and not being known. You know, I think that's very much a strong aspect of her writing, and one can understand, being in such a male world, how she would feel that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both The Promise and Family Lexicon are, in a way, memoirs, but quite strange, right? They both play with the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction. And when reading The Promise, which is, it features a woman drowning who then has this lexicon or encyclopedia of everyone she's known, I kept on thinking of Clarice Lispector's line, I don't want to be auto, I want to be bio, right? That there's this biographical, I think in all three books, the sense of the portraits of others.
Right. Bringing them back to life.
Yeah, but Jenny, I would love to hear you speak about discovering Family Lexicon, and also what Natalia Ginzburg was doing in terms of memoir and novel in this very tricky work. She has the most hilarious intro to announcing what the book is. I would love to hear you speak to it.
Yeah, so in terms of, she was extraordinarily influential on me as a young writer. So when I didn't speak Italian very well when I first went to study in Italy, and a professor of mine said, well, read Natalia Ginzburg, she's deceptively simple. Mm-hmm. And you will get a very good introduction to the language that way. And so I did. So I read a lot of her books when I was quite young, and in particular, Lessico Familiare, Family Lexicon, but also her essay, My Vocation, which is all about becoming a writer as a woman, and all of what that complication entails. So she really made me want to be a writer myself. And so then when the opportunity came up to translate her way later in my life, it was as if, the universe was aligning everything for me. So that was great. And I really, the question of fiction and nonfiction, as we're seeing as we go ahead in the history of literature, it is a very interesting and odd distinction. Mm-hmm. As most distinctions are, right? It's just not very clear, and everybody's using it to their advantage, or how you want it. She says at the beginning of it, I'm actually calling this a novel because I want to get away with anything I need to. but everything is true. And we often say also about novels that they speak to the truth way more than the truth. So yeah, I mean, all of these writers for me are really kind of very modern, if not postmodern, in their sensibility, in their use of language, in their use of juxtaposition, in their use of humor.
Will you read us some from
sure.
Natalia Ginzburg?
Absolutely.
Your translation.
All right, this is from early on in the book. My maternal grandparents both died when I was born. Grandma Pina, my mother's mother, was from a modest family and had married a neighbor. Young, diminutive, and bespectacled, my grandfather was at the beginning of his career as a distinguished lawyer. Every day, my grandmother heard him at the front entrance to the building asking the concierge, "Are there any letters for me?" My grandfather pronounced each T emphatically, as if the one word were actually two. This pronunciation impressed my grandmother as a sign of great refinement. She married him because of his pronunciation and because she wanted a black velvet coat for the winter. It was not a happy marriage. When she was young, my grandmother Pina was blonde and pretty. Once she performed in an amateur drama production. When the curtain rose, my grandmother Pina was on stage with a paintbrush and easel. She said these words, "I cannot go on painting. My soul cannot be constrained by toil and art. It flies from here and is nourished by painful thoughts." My grandfather threw himself into socialism. He was friends with Bisolati, Turati, and Kuleshov. My grandmother Pina stayed out of her husband's political activities because he always packed the house of socialists, full of socialists. My grandmother Pina used to say bitterly in dialect of their daughter, "That girl's gonna marry the gas man." They ended up living separately. In the last years of his life, my grandfather gave up politics and resumed his practice as a lawyer, but he slept until 5 p.m, and when clients turned up, he would say, "What are they doing here? Send them away." At the end of her life, my grandmother Pina lived in Florence. Sometimes she went to visit my mother, who was married by then and also living in Florence. My grandmother Pina, however, was terrified of my father. One day she came to visit my brother Gino, still a babe in arms, who was running a slight fever. My father was nevertheless very worried, and in an effort to calm him down, my grandmother suggested that the fever was due to teething. My father became furious, insisting that teething did not cause fevers. On her way out, my grandmother Pina met my uncle Silvio, who was also coming to visit us. In dialect, she whispered to him on the steps, "Whatever you do, don't say it's the teeth." Beyond "don't say it's the teeth," that girl's going to marry the gas man, and "I cannot go on painting." I don't know anything about this grandmother of mine, and no other words of hers came my way. I do remember, however, often hearing repeated in the family this phrase of hers, also in dialect. "Every day it's something, every day something, and today Drusilla's broken her specs." She had 3 children, Silvia, my mother, and Drusilla, who was short-sighted and always breaking her eyeglasses. My grandmother died alone in Florence after a life full of sorrow. Her eldest child, Silvio, committed suicide when he was 30 by shooting himself in the temple one night in a public park in Milan. I'm gonna stop there just because that is something she does all the time, right? She takes you through all of this, and then boom, there'll be some real, and she's setting it up for actually when her husband dies, and she does the same thing in the book, just with one quick sentence coming kind of out of nowhere, this just horror of what is, and amidst all this humor of what is happening in her work.
I feel like all 3 writers are very distinctive voices, very distinctive writers, but I think are marked by this play between horror and just also hilarity, and that's quite a tonal balance in a work. And I would love to hear the 3 of you speak to the challenges of translating humor, especially this incredibly ferocious wit that is like so distinctive, but also shared by these three writers that you're translating. Humor can't be a case of transcription, right? It has to be a form of, I'm imagining, channeling, but I would love to hear the three of you speak to that. And who wants to start? Margaret?
I don't know. This will sound awfully arrogant, but I don't find it that difficult to translate humor. Anyway, I think because there's a great, in the English language, as we all speak, there's a great tradition of absurdist humor and irony.
Right.
You know, and somehow I think all these three writers have that. They have irony in spades, you know, and so I think it fits really well into the English language.
Yeah.
Huh. And that's also like, it's taking something very seriously almost. Like there's almost like a dead seriousness, and then there's the humor underneath it.
Yeah, there's a kind of deadpan humor. I know, you know, when Jenny was reading,
Right.
there's a wonderful sort of deadpan humor in that, isn't there? You know, if she married him because she wanted to, she looked for his pronunciation, you know, it was wonderful.
It wasn't a happy marriage.
No.
Yeah, I
She
definitely,
got her coat.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with what Margaret said. And actually translating from Argentine writers is very particular in that way, because there's such a great English, tradition there. And, you know, they are part English. I mean, basically, in some ways, just like India, you know, Argentina had a sort of a colonial relationship with England. And Borges's family is part English. And the sense of irony is really our sense of irony. It's curious, when I was translating Manuel Puig, we discovered that actually some of his humor translated better into English than it did to French, because the French are very ironic. But one of the things that he was doing, he was sort of parodying Lonely Hearts letters, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And of course they're corny, you know, and you know, obviously often hiding more than they're saying. And so when it came to translating these letters into French, they just sound like proper French letters, whereas in English they sounded corny and full of falseness. And you know, so it's curious that English was almost closer to Argentine Spanish than French was. Yeah.
Yeah, so I really love the challenge of the humor. I actually do. It's not translating that's hard about humor. I think humor is really hard to write, actually, and get away with, you know, and have it deliver what you need to do. So I always find comedians and people, you know, writers who are able to do humor like at the top of their game. But for me, what's really hard is when the dialect is used to get across the humor. So you're having like several layers of humor in the language. Then trying to do that into English is where I am most challenged.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can imagine that. I think dialect and slang is very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you want to get the several layers. You know, they're using the dialect, the author's using the dialect in order to get a deeper layer of what's happening in language in general. So, you know, you want to keep that layeredness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also a ventriloquism of voices that's happening, especially like in Family Lexicon, the father's voice comes through. It's so hilarious, but also blustery.
Right.
There's such a bluster. And how do you, when you're translating works like this, think about not only the one voice that is the author's voice and your voice somehow merged, but how do you think about all these different voices? Is that something you act out when you're translating, or something you hear is just an ear?
I
Jill?
think you said something very important about the word acting. I think that a translator is somewhat like an actor, and that basically you hear or you read the script, and then what comes out is your art, is your capacity for mimicry in your own language, and of course your resources in your own language. So I think that translators have very quick associative minds, but also the question of voice is so important. So in some ways you really hear that voice and somehow you embody it. in your own language. And as I'm sure as you guys agree, it's very hard to explain ultimately.
So for me, and this I tell my students, and they're shocked and horrified, but ultimately, it comes down to me to ear. So more than language itself, it's the sound. And once I can hear the sound of all the voices, including the narrative voice, including my own, in there, it all starts to come together. I want to make sure that the father has a very big voice in that book, but so does Lydia, the mother. She tends to get a little lost, but she's very, in her own muted way, she's very strong.
Yeah, I think I agree absolutely with Jill that when I read, and when I read in English as well, I hear a voice in my head, and I think when you're translating, as you said, you hear a voice, and there are different voices in everything you translate as well. Right. But somehow, it is a kind of alchemy. I think you just hear that voice, and then you think, oh, that's what it would be. You know, that's what it would be, and somehow you hear it in English. I hear it from Spanish or into English. You know, so it's a bit weird, really, isn't it?
It is, but it's also great company. You know, I find that when I'm translating, like, well, you know, I feel very close to the character, and I say, oh, it's so much fun to hang out with this bungling person who's such a sufferer, and he's
a companion.
He's a fellow bungler, you know, and I get such a kick out of him and or her, and it's just really fun to be with this person. Yeah.
So so the ability to translate more than one work by the same author must feel like continuing with that companionship in some way.
Right. Yeah. Right. Absolutely.
That is an interesting question, Kate, because I often think, like, you know, should there just be one translator for a whole author's whole body of work because of that? But then, you know, each work is itself, and each translation is a thing in unto itself. So I often feel, you know, the more translators translating even the same work, the better, because then you hear different interpretations and different versions of it's like music, right? It's like when you have somebody playing a piece of Chopin, or, you know, and it's going to be different each pianist who plays it.
No, I do agree, but also there's a great pleasure in following a writer through, you know, translating all of a writer's work. You know, that's also very fulfilling, because you feel that you know this person intimately, and so there's a great pleasure, I think, in that.
Yeah. And what you're talking about actually reminds me of my whole experience with Manuel Puig, because I did his 4 of his novels, and the first 3 and then the last one, and he really felt, he felt finally that I was the one who came closest to speaking his language in English, speaking his text in English. So, but sometimes there is a real affinity between a writer and a translator. You know, I think that, of course, it's very important to have different versions as well, because you get different aspects of a writer's work with different voices. And you know, where, you know, it's also funny when you read translation, for example, for me, Marcel Proust will always be that first translation I read, even though I admire very much the other translations, but the one that really is, to me, Proust is the first.
That's
right. I know. And so it's sort of, you know, and of course I appreciate the importance for readers to see other sides of the writer, but that's the one I'm, you know.
But it's funny, Jill, because that speaks to, it's actually Moncrief you're reading even more than
exactly.
If the reader came from Lydia Davis's first, would say, "Oh, I have to read that one. That's Proust."
Yeah.
There's a distinction between a writer like now I'm screwing it up, Natalia Ginzburg, who wrote quite a lot, who's quite prolific.
Yeah.
And then the other 2 writers who were speaking to who, please correct me if I'm wrong, wrote shorter forms, and Empty Wardrobes and The Promise, are these the only novels by each of these writers? And why do we think that is?
Well, you can go.
Are you sure? No, well, no, that's the only novel that Maria Judite de Carvalho wrote. She wrote a novella, and otherwise she wrote short stories. And I think she loved, I don't know, the smallness and the concision of it. And because she could pack such a lot into a short story and into a novella. I mean, the novel is actually just a long novella. It's not a long book at all. But I think it's to do with personality too, that I don't think she wanted to write novels particularly, which is unusual because most writers are pushed to write novels, not short stories. Whereas a short story for me is a very, very difficult form and a fascinating form as well. I love short stories myself.
Right.
What about you, Jill?
Well, there are different kinds of short stories. I mean, obviously in the case of Borges, we have to realize that Borges, Bioy Casares, and Silvina were like one writer. I mean, they actually collaborated together. So, I mean, that was, and I think that in the case of Borges, to a certain extent, his stories were really so dense that in a sense it was a way of writing a novel, but as a story. And that's why we find him so dense and so full of so many layers within his stories. In the case of Silvina, I think that she's much more, her vision is much more fragmentary, and also, there's a lot of trauma in her work, and I think that she captures moments, and for example, Forgotten Journey, there's a lot of, everybody's kind of an outsider kind of character, whether it's a child or a cleaning woman or a circus performer.
Or animals. She writes a lot about animals.
Or animals, yes.
Yeah.
And basically, and often she makes objects seem like people and people seem like objects. So this is sort of a kind of a concentration on reality, on these small bits of reality that I think that the short story probably fits her better. But I think with this last thing, which is really a wonderful book, The Promise, it's a rivulet of linked stories, which are really this, all the people she knew in her life. And so she's trying to somehow, this is her last, because, at that time she had dementia. So in a sense, this book is also showing the mind fighting the dementia, trying to, and of course, capture, in some ways, the dementia is also writing. So there's a kind of a last effort to kind of grasp the life that is going, and I think that that's why this longer narrative came out, this each character in her life having to say something,
Yeah.
I also think of Ginsburg as writing the small, certainly the essays, but writing the small, all three writers is writing the small in a different way, especially Ginsburg's lens towards the domestic and the day and the family.
She never wrote a long novel. I mean, her novels are all very short too. She's very succinct, and I mean, maybe it's about, women not feeling like they have, or, feeling like it all has to be said quickly and succinctly, but who, it was.
But could it possibly have to do with time and space at that time? Like in terms of having the time? I mean, these writers are also, we haven't really brought up the question of gender and time period and milieu, like you've alluded to it a little bit, but what was it like being a writer in their time period? And all of these three writers were also pretty distinctive for being wives of intellectuals who I would hazard to say were more well-known than they were in their lifetime. How did that impact how they were received during their time?
I'll just say about Maria Judite that she was married to a writer, Urbano Tavares Rodrigues, and he was much more famous. He was very supportive of her always, but he was much more famous than she was. And I think they get overshadowed. I think women writers often get overshadowed, especially at that time. I mean, they're all writing about the same period, these women writers. And I think it was hard to be a woman writer and get noticed.
I think, again, in the case of Silvina, that she was basically, I keep emphasizing the group because there's something, collaboration was the form of writing of these. And if you look at the bibliography, you'll see all the works they did together. But it's not only that, it's that they that the author didn't matter. It was the ideas and the work that mattered. I think that's very much a Borges' style, but it's also Silvina. That's also her, but in a much different way. And I would say that you have to compare Silvina's, she comes from a very wealthy family. They were a little bit like the Bloomsbury group, it was sort of like Virginia Woolf and Leonard and this writer and that writer. They were kind of like a group that worked together or fed each other in a way. But there's no doubt that she was the most modern, because, and even though, and they, Borges should say, well, he's ultimate postmodernism, but because she was so oblique, her style was so oblique, it was very hard, I think, for readers to try to, she came off as very strange, let's put it that way, and less accessible, in the sense that she was trying to capture things that were very difficult to make into text, and I think so. That I think that that may very well be part of why she was less recognized. But I still believe also that the fact that she was a woman, there's no doubt about it. But Bioy Casares too was a rather marginal writer, so they were kind of marginals amongst themselves. I mean, I think all these situations are very individualistic. But I do think that there's a Me Too, that Silvina really precedes the Me Too whole era, because she really talks a lot also about abuse, and that's not something that people talked about then in Latin America, but she presents it in very oblique ways, but it's still a very strong, subject.
So just, Ginsburg, her whole book, Family Lexicon, is really, the background is fascism, a very oppressive father, patriarchy institutions everywhere. So she wasn't even allowed to go to school because she was a girl, and her father just said, oh, you're a girl, nothing will come of you. And this is why I want to emphasize the voice of Lydia here in this book, because through a kind of subversive love of storytelling, Lydia was teaching her daughter how she could have a voice through the written word. Yeah. And it's just, really, and of course she goes on, Ginsburg goes on to marry a very famous writer himself, Leone, and it's, of course, his death that then she becomes the writer in the family. So yeah, you're very right that it's.
I just think of that. I once read somewhere that Cesar Pavez said to her, stop having children and write a novel better than mine. There's this idea that they were
at Einaudi, a publisher, with him, and he really encouraged her.
But did this have something to do with attitudes towards what literature should be at the time? We're talking about these women writing in pretty oppressive periods, and fascism, the Salazar regime, Argentina. Was it perhaps the subject matter that they chose that had something to do with how they were received, or if they were translated and how they were remembered?
And I mean, Maria Judite's writing about very ordinary people. It's very, I suppose it's realism in a way, but I think also what you get in her work is, she's writing, during the Salazar period and just post-Salazar. So there's this, she was brought up in this very repressive society, very narrow-minded society. And she never mentions the politics at all. But I think it's almost as if the characters have had that imprinted on them. So that they're steeped in that awful narrowness. And so I think it's very political, her work, in that sense.
Making the domestic political. And, they probably weren't because the subject matter was family and domestic, they can get away with it, you know. And then of course we've seen how the domestic novel then gets co-opted by men and it's called something else. But you know, yes, this is how they were able to actually even have a voice. But the voice they wanted too, I think.
Yeah, and in the case of Latin America, you have to understand that the 20s, 30s, 40s was still, you know, realism was a very important style, you know, regionalism. Let's, you know, writers were focused on, you know, precisely portraying social corruption, injustice, and that the realist narrative, the Marxist realist narrative, was really dominant then, actually. And so writers like Silvina Ocampo or Borges were really, you know, considered off-center, you know, doing this magic, you know, this, what became magical realism, of course, came also out of what Borges was doing, la literatura fantástica, no? Fantastic literature. And so, I mean, basically, all three of them as a group were really kind of, with other friends, by the way, and there's many other, I'm not mentioning, women writers and male writers that were sort of kind of, they were sort of like subversives. They were subversives in this context of the domination of realism. So that's where Borges and Silvina Ocampo came out of that, you know, writing a kind of literature that would express the reality maybe in a greater, more true way, but certainly not literal as realism is, right? So there was a certain, you know, I think in the Latin American case, it's a very particular political environment, you know.
But I'm curious. I mean, I'm still stuck on the fact that I had never heard about Ocampo, and that's obviously my own blind spot. But I have definitely heard of Casares and of course Borges, who's one of my favorite writers. And I'm wondering whether you think that women writers have been less translated. I know, Jenny, you spoke before that you feel
there's no wondering.
No, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And there are many wonderful writers that we, as well as Ocampo, like Marta Brunet, or you know, Maria Luisa Bombal. I mean, there's a whole number of really wonderful women writers, of which the general public in English knows very little.
Is it harder to get those translations published?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So statistically, in the United States, we publish, and England, we publish 3% of our books published are in translation. The rest of the world, it's anywhere between 30 to 70% of their books are in translation. Of that 3%, I think, and there are people who've done the statistics, you know, beautifully, but I think it's 25% of that 3% is women.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
It's interesting. There seems to be some women writers that break through. Obviously, Elena Ferrante, and so then so many writers, women translated, are compared to Ferrante. Liz Spector, and I would say now Natalia Ginzburg has broken through in the English language. And so in order to almost promote these other writers, they're often compared to Liz Spector, Ginzburg, or I forgot my third one. Oh, Ferrante, Ferrante, of course.
And Morante, Elsa Morante is another one.
Yes, and Elsa Morante, but I think Elsa Morante is perhaps less read than Ferrante, even though she was her favorite writer.
But I'm going to work hard to change that. Me and Anne Goldstein, who's also.
I love Elsa Morante.
I love her.
Love it. Yeah, I love her.
Yeah.
Why do you think Ginzburg is having this moment now in the English language?
I'm a little sensitive to time, but I have a good story there. I mean, I translated.
They could kick us out.
I translated the book in, I think, 2014 or. And there was problems with the estate, and so it looked like there were two previous translations, so there was something out there. But it looked like my translation just wasn't going to see the light of day. And then right after, that got resolved, and the book was published right after the election of Trump in 2016.
Yeah.
And it, for me, even rereading it, I read a totally new book, because what happens in there is nobody believes that fascism is happening. They think Mussolini is a buffoon. They just say this could never happen. It's, you know, it's going to go away. And then, you know, we're seeing the possibility of what was going to happen in the US, or could happen. And she was just describing exactly what it was like to live at the time when fascism starts creeping into your life.
Yeah.
So then it had a way different resonance with the readership.
Mhm.
I think there's hunger for voices, and I think women's voices that are witty and angry and profound as these.
Like Cristina Rivera Garza, I think she's wonderful. And it was such a pleasure to work with her on the Taiga syndrome, which was a very unusual book.
I love that book so
Yeah,
much.
yeah. No, I'm one of the pleasures of the latter part of my life here is that I am getting to know and work with and be able to work with women writers that are just fantastic. The last one I did was Guadalupe Nettel, a wonderful writer from Mexico, very, very perverse and charming and really out there. This book was called Bezoar and Other Unsettling Stories. Another story writer, but certainly absolutely wonderful.
I wanted to ask, because of the title of this event, Claiming Space, there's, you know this much more than me, but there's been a lot of discussion lately about visibility and invisibility in regards to translation and translators. And it strikes me that this is perhaps a parallel conversation to the question of these women who are wives and collaborators, the question of the collaborator and how gendered that labor can often be, as well as invisible. But I'm wondering what you're thinking about the question of two lines, this translation of Empty Wardrobes. I don't know if my camera's on, I'm hiding myself. This translation of Empty Wardrobes is published by Two Lines Press. The idea of two lines that the translator should also be on the cover, should be more visible, that this invisibility should be brought to the fore and be made visible. And I'm wondering how, right now, just to take a temperature, how you're all thinking about that.
Well, I mean, the translator's name should obviously appear on the cover.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean,
sometimes you have to do so much work to figure out who a translator is. It seems.
Yeah, it just seems so obvious.
If you look into who did get their names on translations in the past, it would be the male translators. And of course, translation is predominantly female, I think. So there is a certain correlation there between invisibility and translation.
Oh, absolutely.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Jill?
Well, often publishers say, publishers will often say, well, if people see that it's a translation, they won't pick it up. So that was the big excuse for not putting the translator's name on the cover, right? It's really.
Yes, because everything really should be written in English.
Of course.
Right.
So like the pretense that it is the author, like almost to bring in the labor of the translator, takes away something for the reader.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We just get in the way, really.
Well, I think we might be at time. Pierce, are we at time?
We are. We have a couple questions, which I'd love to get to, at least two, if you guys don't mind staying another couple minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Kate, would you like to read them, or do you want me to?
Sure. So Philo Cohen, who's a wonderful young French translator, just asked, do you have any advice for a new translator? Like any advice for someone, she translates from French to English, but any advice for a young translator starting out?
Just the best thing you could ever do.
It's a practice, right?
It's a practice, and if you, like anything, like being a writer, if you persevere, things will happen for you. So just keep doing it. And our community of translators is so fabulous. We're incredibly supportive. Everybody will help you. And I think everybody should be a translator. So
Gregory Rabassa was my teacher when I was very young. I took a course with him, and so that's when I was just first beginning to translate. And so I went up and asked him, well, Gregory, how does one start translating? He says, you know how? Start translating.
Exactly. No, it is something you just do. I would also say read a lot in your own language and in the original language, but especially almost in your own language.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A translator usually begins as a passionate reader. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Lee Percy wants to know, how important is place to your translation practice in terms of spending time in Italy, in Portugal, in Latin America? How important is the connection to place in your work?
One thing I will say, since I began my life in New York, I think that if I hadn't grown up and begun my work in New York, I don't see how I would have done the work I've done, because I feel like New York is the greatest city in this country, and without the cultural support and environment and life, I would think it's much more difficult to become engaged. Although I know that the other is true, that people coming from the Midwest are, they come to New York and they have more energy than the New Yorkers. But the whole point is that I felt that starting in New York at the time that I started was a real, a real help to my life as a translator, so I can't imagine how I would have done it without those first years in New York. But,
hello, Lee.
I know.
I'm no see, and I don't see you, but hello.
He's a film editor.
He's a film editor. Okay, so that's such an interesting question, because of course, place, Torino, I have it behind me, but of course it's virtual and I'm in New York. That's translation, right? So you need to know the place. The Torino is very much a character in all of Ginzburg. But the fact that I'm not from Torino and that I am from New York, or, have sensibility of other places, and I'm translating for an audience that's in English or American, means that I can be in both spaces. And I think that is really important in translation, to know your audience as well as your author.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, I think early on, it was very important for me to have lived in Spain and Portugal. Right. But now that's all still in me. Spain and Portugal is still in me, and so what really matters to me now is actually English. Right. I love the English language, and that's what I work with.
Right. Yeah. No, it's true. As a student, I spent a whole year in Madrid when I was very young.
Oh,
yeah. And I also think place is just, again, with New York, everybody's there. So, in a sense, or in Paris, the Latin Americans were all in Paris, they were all in New York. So in a sense, but certainly being there, having lived in Spain, having, been there is absolutely essential.
Oh, yeah.
And if anything, COVID taught us we're all everywhere.
Yes. And this Zoom event probably wouldn't have been able to happen otherwise.
No.
Well, thank you. It's really such a pleasure and such an honor to speak to the three of you. I've admired your translations, and I love being introduced to these three wonderful writers. And I hope everyone gets Empty Wardrobes and Family Lexicon and the Ocampo City Lights books, the translations, because they're so wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. It's been lovely to meet you all. Thank you so much.
It's been lovely, absolutely. And thank you, Kate. This has been great. And
it was all pleasure.
Thank you all so much. This has been a treat. I could not stop you for anything. This is incredible. It's a great honor to host the three of you. Kate, it is a joy to have you. I just want to quickly show, we have Empty Wardrobes in stock. We have Thank you to City Lights for these beautiful
They're
books.
such
Also
beautiful
have-
small books too. The size of them are so
They're
beautiful.
so great.
I know,
yeah.
they're great. And there's a photo of Silvina that's very typical of her, where her hand is in front of her face.
Yeah.
We have Family Lexicon. We have other works from NYRB, including this other book of Ocampo's. We also have Natalia Ginzburg's New Direction books and more. So you have no shortage of things to pick out to read. We please encourage you to shop local, shop early if you're thinking about the holidays. Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
So
Thank
much.
you.
Bye.
Bye.